On 1st of March, the Tanzanian government approved a deal between Tesla, Uranex Tanzania Limited, and Magnus Technologies Tanzania that would allow Tesla to purchase a minimum of 17,500 tons of graphite at a fixed price over 3 years from 2025. Now, graphite is a key component in Tesla's rechargeable lithium-ion batteries. It is clear that the global landscape is moving towards renewable energy and electric vehicles. And this has whet investor appetite for access to critical minerals like graphite, lithium, nickel, manganese, and cobalt. This will fuel Africa's just energy transition. Well, African mines produce a variety of battery metals and will be able to increase production of these metals to take advantage of the global energy transition. However, these raw materials are exported to Europe and China, where value is added to them. Processes such as processing, smelting, and refining that occur before EV battery assembly can't be performed in Africa because there's no infrastructure for it. How sustainable is this new scramble for Africa's battery minerals? And has the continent truly quantified the environmental, social, and governance consequences of digging deeper into its mines? Well, I have here with me today two experts, Simiso Velempini, Managing Director of Vele Africa Advisory, an Africa-focused strategic advisory firm that supports clients in operating on the continent, and also Andrew Sekandi, Managing Director of African Metals Group, a private resource investment company acquiring a portfolio of ethical and sustainable resource assets in gold and strategic metals. Great to have you both on the show this morning, Simiso and Andrew.
Thanks you, Rolake.
So, Simiso, I think since we led with the Tanzania story, which was actually sourced from your company, Vele Advisory, I'd like to start with you. What is the implication of this transaction for the Tanzanian government?
Well, firstly, we thought the story was quite interesting because historically Tanzania is often known as the more sleepier neighbor in the East Africa region compared to a lot of the investment flows that go into Kenya, Uganda, and even Rwanda and DRC. And so we thought it was quite interesting, particularly as you've mentioned in your intro, given the development of the just energy transition. I think it's also quite notable that this transaction happened, as have several significant investments since the ascension of President Hassan to the presidency, following the untimely passing away of her predecessor, Magufuli, former President Magufuli. She's really come in with a more open attitude towards foreign investment. She has worked quite hard in repairing relations with the private sector as well as foreign investors. And she's really demonstrated a much more muscular foreign policy, particularly in the region. And I think that's a really good thing. But to answer your question specifically in terms of what that means for Tanzania, I think it really opens up a new avenue of interest in its mining sector. Historically, a lot of attention has focused on the gold and gemstone industry as it relates to mining. And I think we're going to see a new push around some of those critical minerals that you've mentioned, particularly graphite and copper.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting take there on Tanzania. Now, Andrew, we had this chart or this map that showed Africa's mineral production in the context of the globe. What do you think is really fueling this new search for African minerals? Is it really just the global energy transition?
Thanks, Rolake. So the energy transition is a big part of this new scramble for African minerals. It's clear to see governments have set these very ambitious net zero targets by 2050. And that's a very minerally intensive exercise. Electric vehicles need about 6 times more metals than conventional vehicles. Onshore wind farms need about 9 times more metals than gas-fired plants. So energy transition is clearly a major driver behind the scramble, or this new scramble for African minerals. But it's not the full story. Geopolitics has a major role to play in this. The entire world is extremely dependent on China for access to these raw materials that are so essential to energy transition. China controls about 80% of the world's rare earth elements, about 80% of the world's cobalt, and around 70% of the world's lithium. So you're starting to see countries around the world try to decouple and decrease their reliance on China, particularly around the US. So this creates a geopolitical overlay, which is also very, very important in terms of this new scramble for African minerals.
Yeah, interesting. So which metals are providing the biggest attraction in Africa for these foreign investors?
Well, really anything that goes into electric vehicle infrastructure or renewable energy, which is to say solar panels, wind turbines, and other infrastructure. So if you look at the International Energy Agency, leading up to 2040, they're predicting we'll need 40 times more lithium, 20 times more cobalt, 18 times more nickel, and about 5 to 6 times more rare earth metals. So those are clearly really leading indicators in terms of the demand. But also, if you look at the US, each year they publish a list of critical metals, which they deem to be essential for economic development and for national security. And there are about 50 metals on that list currently. So there's a whole broad range of metals that are going to be in demand going forward.
Yeah, very interesting. And, Simiso, some of these deals are no longer just being spearheaded by China, Chinese companies. But here you have a Tesla seeking raw materials from Africa. How might this impact other global economic interests or geopolitical interests in Africa, if you like?
Well, I think we'll still continue to see strong interest from the traditional players, the ones that we're used to. The US, China, as Andrew has mentioned, is quite significant. And the EU. However, I think we'll also see more interest from mid-level powers such as not China, but such as Canada and Australia, which traditionally have a strong junior mining sector that's quite heavy on exploration. So I think we're likely to see an uptick in investment from companies that are domiciled in those countries. But I think going back to what Andrew said as well, I think a lot of it is around looking at trying to secure supply and ensuring that, there's supply chain security. So it's not just about access to these critical minerals, but ensuring that there's security of the supply chain. And in terms of demand, I think we only have to look at the countries that have passed policies and regulatory frameworks that are really pushing this just transition to see where that demand will be coming from.
Yeah, interesting point about the policy and regulatory frameworks. Do you think this new scramble for Africa's minerals is actually providing an opportunity for African governments to negotiate better deal terms with investors and foreign companies?
Well, I think the opportunity to negotiate better deals has always been there. I think a lot of it comes down to the will to do it. We're not talking about a situation where, we're not in 1960, 1970, where there are very few, accomplished and technically capable Africans that can negotiate these contracts. There's so many people that have the skills and the technical competence to really ensure that African countries get the best deal possible. I think it's a question of whether the governments are allowing these people into the rooms and are relying on their technical expertise when these negotiations are taking place.
Yes, indeed. And that's always been a long-running concern of how these deals are negotiated and the capacity of African bureaucracy and administration to negotiate equitable terms for these deals. Now, Andrew, from an investment perspective, one of the things that Africa can do with a lot now is foreign direct investment. We're seeing high levels of debt, macroeconomic headwinds across the continent. Which countries do you think are likely to be the biggest beneficiaries of this new wave of attraction from foreign investment for African battery minerals, based on the work you do?
Sure. So, Rolake, there's no clear data yet in terms of how this new scrap for African minerals has impacted FDI. We're still waiting for that data to come through. But anecdotally, we're seeing a huge ramp up in investment across the continent. If you look at the 2020 figures, which are the most recently available, you'll have seen that Guinea topped the list in Africa for FDI into mining at $8 billion, followed by the DRC, Egypt, Ghana, and Burkina Faso. But those numbers can be a bit misleading because sometimes it's a huge investment in a single
So, Simiso, I was talking to Andrew there before he cut off. He was talking about the countries that were most attractive for foreign investment for these big mining deals. But if we look at electric vehicles, which are the heart of a lot of this, and I think we had a graphic there that showed the typical mineral component of a lithium-ion battery. I'm wondering whether my team can show those figures. I'm seeing here somewhat of a conflict between Africa's move to transition to cleaner energy and its bid to pursue more sustainable policies in its minerals or mining sector. So what I'm saying is, yes, we want cleaner forms of energy, i.e. we want solar, we want battery-driven sources of power that power electric vehicles, but we need to go deeper into the mines, and there are many sustainable environmental challenges there. You know, how can we resolve this conflict? What do governments need to do?
Well, easy question. I'd start off by actually decoupling the two things that you've mentioned. I think the first one, in terms of Africa moving into taking part in the just energy transition, I think in some ways that's a little bit overblown, considering the fact that a lot of countries are still trying to secure enough power to just get onto the grid in and of itself. So I don't know in so much if the same phrase necessarily works in the same way when we're talking about African countries. I think the people who, or rather the countries that are predominantly going through this transition at this point in the way that we describe it is these are developed countries. And they are transitioning from, more carbon-emitting sources to cleaner energy. Africa is still trying to figure out, in a lot of countries, its energy mix. I think we only need to look at South Africa, for example, which has said as much as they're participating in the just energy transition, coal will still be a part of their energy mix until 2050. So, I think in terms of Africa and where it's going, I think we're in a slightly different position. However, we do play a role because a lot of these minerals are located on the continent. In terms of, I think, what it means for more sustainable mining policies, I will say that in the majority of African countries, the policy and regulatory framework is there. It's more a question of enforcement. And I think that's really where a lot of countries fall short. A lot of work has been done by legislators to ensure that there is a robust framework, whether we're talking in terms of how mining operations are conducted, or the environmental impacts, or how companies should act in relation to communities. All of that is there. It's just a question of enforcing it.
Yeah, and I think I would suggest that robust regulatory framework also has to look at how much value is created locally. I had this interesting value chain depiction of, in monetary dollar terms, how much value is created at different parts of the value chain. I'm sure we'll see that flash on the screen right now. But in your opinion, what do African economies need to do to harness the value from these minerals locally before they're exported abroad? I mean, you can see from one of the charts I had that if you move further down the end of the value chain, you had, for instance, electric vehicles valued at around 7 trillion, whereas in the earlier stages of the mining process, the figure is much lower. I believe it was figure 4 that we had that particular depiction. What are your thoughts as to how African governments can harness more value locally?
Well, I think going back to a question that you asked me previously about the ability to negotiate some of these contracts, I think also the concept of Scramble for Africa is always quite interesting because it really positions Africa in quite a passive role in the dynamic. Things are always happening to the continent, but there isn't a lot of agency in that approach. So I think, from an African government's perspective, not only shifting mindset, but also shifting the narrative about what that means and what African government's role is in that so-called scramble. They effectively are the gatekeepers, and they have a role to play in ensuring that whatever investment flows into the country ultimately serves whatever strategic development goals that the country has. Everywhere from Egypt all the way down to Lesotho, every country has a 5-year development plan. Almost every country has a Vision 2030 and beyond. And a lot of that centers on ways in which to develop the economy. And a part of that involves industrialization. So I think a lot of it involves having those tough conversations to say, we understand that, company X wants to come in and invest in this cobalt mine or this graphite mine. However, what we require is smelting in country or refining in country or beneficiation before that mineral is exported. And then I'd also just add one more thing, is I think also in terms of manufacturing some of these components, whether it's batteries or solar panels, it's astounding to me that a lot of that isn't actually taking place on the continent, which has a significant need for solar panels, maybe not so much EV batteries quite yet, but I think solar panels should be something that should be able to be manufactured on the continent.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Simiso. We're going to take a quick break, but do stay tuned as our deep dive continues on Africa's battery minerals. See you in a moment. Welcome back to Business Week here on Arise News. I was chatting to Andrew Sekandi and Simiso Velempini about the new scramble for Africa's battery minerals. Andrew, great to see you back on screen. Before you jumped off earlier, I was asking you about the countries that were the most attractive for foreign investors with regards to this new scramble for minerals, and you were in mid-flow, so please continue.
Sure. Thank you, Olake. I was just saying, looking historically back to 2022, the countries that really dominated FDI were Guinea, the DRC, Egypt, Ghana, and Burkina Faso. But those stats can be a bit misleading because one single major investment in a country can really skew those statistics. So I think what we're actually seeing is a much broader set of interest across a number of countries, including countries like Namibia, countries like Zambia, but really those countries that are able to create the most favorable investment environment and that still have considerable minerals. I think those are the ones which are going to get the most interest, but it will really be across the board.
Yeah, and in terms of creating the most favorable environment, there's also creating value. And I see we have that chart, those numbers on screen now, looking at the mineral value chain. And if you look throughout the value chain, you can see that the early stages of mining are delivering around $11 billion worth of value. But if you look at the electric vehicles stage, which is essentially where manufacturing and assembling comes into play, we're looking at $7 trillion of value created globally. Can Africa ever hope to capture much more value for domestic economies in this sector? What are your thoughts, and how can this be done?
It's not going to be easy. It's very clear to policymakers that we need to try and go up the value creation curve. But that takes a tremendous amount of infrastructure. And we're starting on a back foot because countries like China have been investing in this processing value-added infrastructure for decades. So it's possible, it's necessary, we need to do it regardless, but we need to be realistic about the challenges that are involved in that. And I think a lot of that starts on the policy side with government, making it easy for these investors to come in and create the sort of environment needed to build up the value chain.
Yes, indeed. You talk about making it easy for investors. I know Botswana several years ago did try that with its diamond sector and had some level of success. So clearly that is possible on the continent. Now, many years ago, and I guess yourself or Simiso can pick up this one as we move the program to a close. Many years ago, when we had the issue of blood and conflict diamonds, the global powers and economies came up with the Kimberley process, which is a certification process for diamonds. So if you went into a shop to buy a diamond ring, you could ask if the diamond ring had a Kimberley certificate to ensure that those diamonds were not sourced from mines where there were unethical practices or were sourced from conflict-ridding countries. Do you see scope for such a regime emerging globally, given the huge demand for lithium-ion batteries and other battery minerals and the global move in terms of the energy transition? I'd like to start with you, Andrew, and then perhaps move to Simiso.
Yes, so we're seeing these policies already being put in place, right, which require end users as well as people across the value chain, companies across the value chain, to trace and track where these minerals are coming from. The policies are in place. As Simiso said earlier, the implementation is very, very sketchy and patchy across different countries and different minerals. But what's encouraging is to see the advent of things like blockchain technology, which are making it easier for service providers to track and trace each individual metal from the mine site to the end user. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that coming up across the continent. The policies are there, we just need the implementation. Yeah,
Simiso, I'll ask you the same thing because I know you've done quite a bit of work in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is strong consumer interest in traceability. I think it's yet a question to see, well, the question needs to be asked, are consumers willing to pay more for the cost of tracing some of these minerals? And we don't have any conclusive answers yet. I think with a mineral such as diamonds, it's quite different when comparing it with some of the essentially the critical minerals that we're discussing here today. So again, the question becomes if a wide-ranging framework, because again, when we talk about traceability, yes, there's the option for blockchain, but again, there's certain processes that need to be monitored and evaluated on site, and this can be a costly exercise in and of itself, which the company will bear and have to pass on that cost to the consumer. Are consumers willing to pay more? Again, it's a question that needs to be asked, and we don't have the answer yet.
Yeah.
But in terms of a broad framework similar to the Kimberley process, personally, I would hope there wouldn't be a need for that, because the Kimberley process arose as a result of, as you mentioned in your remarks, a very bloody and very just distressing situation in Angola. And I would hope that this so-called scramble for critical minerals doesn't trigger or inflate or fan the flames of a similar type of conflict. I do think as well, the elephant in the room to a certain extent is the DRC, which we haven't touched on, which is home to a lot of these minerals and which in and of itself is currently experiencing significant security issues along the border with Rwanda. So some of these minerals are currently sitting in the midst of conflict situations. I think it's a question as to how companies and governments look to deal with that.
Yeah, indeed. And I have to touch on DRC because there's an issue of the fairness and equitability of these minerals. So, Andrew, I wanted to give you the last shot to answer this. Many governments in Africa have a strategy focusing on extracting as much as they can upfront from companies in terms of the fiscal or tax regime. But how can African economies actually that have pressing or debt challenges balance this to focus more on creating value along the value chain rather than so much focus on the tax and fiscals upfront? What are your thoughts?
You're right, Rolake. Mining royalties are one thing and they're important, but we need to prioritize local value creation. So there's a few things governments can do. One is try to create policies which create a bit of a more level playing field to attract a broader set of investors, because that creates competition and hopefully better terms. We need to heavily incentivize exploration and production, even if that means giving up a small amount of value in the short term in exchange for longer term gains. But in exchange for that, you need to demand something from these investors and these mining companies. Demand local content development, demand skills transfer, demand investment in this processing infrastructure. So we're not just exporting raw materials, but over time, we're starting to develop more value added products, and governments will begin to benefit from that if they take a longer term view.
Thank you very much. Great discussion there with Simiso Velempini of Vele Africa Advisory and Andrew Sekandi of the African Metals Group. Thank you so much for joining me on the show.